Hello and welcome. My name is Alex Brown, and today I want to talk to you about contextualizing vulnerability data so you can bring it to life. And why do you want to do that? I mean, you might ask yourself, and I'd respond by asking if you've ever been in a scenario where you're presented with or have seen a large list of vulnerabilities and little knowledge of what that might mean to your business. So the impact those vulnerabilities might have on your achieving your business objectives. I mean, how do you prioritize that list of thousands of vulnerabilities past the obvious and just ordering it by severity or impact? So if that rings a bell with you, then I just want 10 minutes of your time. And I'm gonna let's have a chat about how we can do and live a better life there. So let's set the scene. So your business needs to grow, it needs to meet its objectives, and in order to govern its day-to-day operations, its strategic objectives. You'll probably be using a variety of risk management techniques and processes, probably to help you understand and make visible the risk that's associated with these activities. So your risk management strategy may stretch all the way from the boardroom down into the depths of IT and technical and tactical activities. Ultimately, though, your business and service owners just want to meet their objectives, and these processes are there to ensure the business understands the exposure, relative risk and impact of doing so. So your risk management dashboard and status reporting is in pretty good shape. You've got, RAG status is green, and so everyone's happy. Equally, you may have a compliance management activity going on. So you've established a compliance framework or maybe frameworks. You're working hard to ensure the business adheres to those frameworks. So you are deploying and testing and auditing suitable controls. And I imagine those controls are probably mostly documentation or process based. And so again, your compliance dashboard is in pretty good shape. Status reporting is showing green across the board. At the same time, in our figurative basement, IT and security leaders are kind of being swamped with issues. They're struggling with attack surface expansion. They're managing an ever-changing digital supply chain. They're defending your identity management solutions, and they're dealing with, frankly, a crippling skill shortage at the moment. Their budgets are tight, and it's likely to be cut as they're struggling to really justify existing spend, let alone increase spend. And so they're managing a huge list of potential vulnerabilities across hundreds, maybe even thousands of IT assets, with little knowledge about really where to best apply effort, apart from ordering in severity order. It's hard to know where to prioritize because you want to do the best thing for the business, but unless you have a meaningful way of prioritizing that work effort, things often get remediated by whoever shouts loudest. And if you ask any paramedic, they can tell you categorically the loudest patient is probably not the highest concern. It's probably the quiet ones that you should be prioritizing for triage. So how is this scenario a reality for us? How can we have green lights on one side of that wall and red alarm bells going off on the other? Ultimately, it's very easy to ignore the fact that most organizations these days now are wholly reliant on the IT systems and software that underpin them. And so the technical teams have a really complex problem on their hands. How do they prioritize the vulnerabilities and gap reduction remediation activities in an organization that doesn't think there's necessarily anything wrong or at risk? So let's look at why this happens. And one of the big reasons it happens is a breakdown in language. So the language of business doesn't really translate into IT, and frankly, vice versa. IT and even business are absolutely swamped in three-letter acronyms that are dense and very difficult to understand unless you are an expert in that area. And so business assets or processes which are focused on delivering business value and outcomes. So there are processes you recognize: joiners, movers, leavers, revenue operations, pipeline generation, really critical processes. They have little or no knowledge of the IT assets required to drive that process and make it successful. And those same technical assets are so kind of acronym dense and require such great levels of knowledge to understand what they actually do that it's difficult to comprehend to anybody who isn't really an expert. But they fundamentally underpin that process. And so both parties are independently doing the best thing for the business, but neither party understands each other truly, and that results in kind of poor decision making and has pretty much unknown dependencies. So a good example of this that I've come across in my prior years is regarding a data privacy project, GDPR specifically in the UK. I worked with the IT team very closely, and it was very apparent to me that when conversations were being had with the legal team, who owned the process and owned the requirement to, to become compliant to a degree, then it was very clear that legal saw this as a documentation exercise, and the IT team saw it as a technical challenge. And that is an issue because they were not talking the same language at all. So where does it leave us? Well, it leaves us needing to agree on a view of the world that is common and provides us with what we need to translate from legal or business language into the world of IT. And so we need to agree on a process or service-centric view of the world. And arbitrarily, a process is defined as a work item that creates value and sets responsibilities. And often processes will have context. So it's framed in very business language, which means it means almost nothing to most people working in IT. But all processes are underpinned these days by digital assets. Digital transformation is a thing, it's here to stay. And so it's very likely that nearly all processes inside a business have a translation to technical assets at some level. And just to be clear, I know that assets don't really look like this. I mean, we are very aware that assets look a bit more like this. It's a mishmash of interdependent, spider web, which essentially is stored inside your CMDB, which may or may not be up to date, depending on, again, how you maintain that. However, just for this presentation, we'll just assume it's a nice, neat line because it fits on the screen better. So mapping business outcomes through to processes, and those processes could be anything from customer retention, demand gen, brand awareness, and whatever they may be. The outcomes. So they map those outcomes to processes, and making sure those processes are very clearly mapped to the IT assets that underpin them. That is a nirvana that's worth fighting for, because at that point you also get linkage through to the underpinning threats and vulnerabilities we've been discussing. So even in the depths of the most difficult business outcome, and in the depths of the most technical IT project, we gain critical context. So that IT team suddenly understands the linkage between a vulnerability they're staring at in a pen test report, and the business outcome is trying to be achieved that relies on that vulnerability being fixed. So if I make statements like we need to improve customer retention by 5 basis points this month, or we need to close X million pounds worth of new business this quarter, that can be translated directly into language which the IT team can understand which threats and vulnerabilities and assets can be prioritized for remediation and for concern based on that linkage. So in this particular area, the middle bit is by far the hardest. Understanding how to map a process to an asset is difficult. Line of business owners, how do you get them to understand and care about threats and vulnerabilities that threaten their outcomes? Well, you link it through and demonstrate to them directly that actually their process and their outcome is materially at risk due to perhaps threats and vulnerabilities that you're exposed to. Then IT leaders, well, these teams are often very focused on kind of implementation, tactical implementation work of technical controls or remediation, day-to-day operations, and just fixing issues. But ultimately, they should be helping drive value by helping improve processes, helping to reduce attack surfaces, which is one of the big issues they're trying to deal with in the first place. So it is a nirvana worth reaching, worth getting to. And ultimately, if we look at what that new world feels like, well, the business can finally properly devolve decision-making, because line of business owners and process owners, they truly understand the relative threat levels inherent in their processes. It's much easier to show and demonstrate that you're protecting what you need when you need it for the business, and therefore spend against that effort. And remediation efforts, where we started the presentation, they can be much more easily prioritized and targeted, because you understand what that remediation effort is seeking to resolve in terms of business outcome. And ultimately, when it comes to things like cyber awareness, cyber visibility, assurance activities, then you can really enhance the organization's resilience to cyber attack, because again, you can prioritize where you need to worry. So before we take a quick look at what this might look like in the real world, then let's just kind of revise and look at 3 key things you can do here to help you on this journey. The first thing is we need to agree on that service-centric view of the world. That process-centric view of the world is key. And then mapping that through to your IT assets. I mean, that is a process in its own right, and it is difficult, but it deserves time, attention. It will require considerable effort, but it will be worth it. What you need then is appropriate tooling to absorb this information and to hold the mappings and hold the hierarchy in one place, so that when we agree on our service-centric view of the world, we actually have a place to go and view it and a place to manipulate it and understand how the mappings are working. And then finally, we need an appropriate testing mechanism. And again, because we have the prior to, we can now implement an appropriate and measured assurance activity, which is prioritized according to business value and threat level, not based on whoever's shouting loudest. So let's take a look at this in practice. And so here we are, and we're looking here at a process. And our process here is payroll and expenses. So pretty common process. We can see all the standard stuff that is inherent in a process. We can look at who owns it, what it's trying to achieve. Perhaps we can see the contextualization of that process, like which business function owns it and where it's being applied. If we scroll down that list, we can also come and look at all the kind of associations that are inherent in that process. And here we can see this process has been very clearly linked to two IT assets. So we have a Windows operating system and we have an Iris payroll business system, bit of software. So we can very clearly see, and actually we're starting to see vulnerability data already. Because there is a linkage there, we can actually demonstrate through testing assurance activities, there are vulnerabilities inherent in the system. You can see here, we've got about 80, 90 odd vulnerabilities at present. But I want to drill in here. I want to drill into the Iris payroll system to take a look at that IT asset. So here I am in the asset. You can see the breadcrumb at the top of the screen is giving me context about where I am. And again, this is an IT asset in a similar fashion. It has an owner. We understand whether it's active or passive. We understand whether what this system is trying to achieve for the business. And if I scroll down, I now very clearly can see visible how many vulnerabilities are currently mapped to this IT asset. So in this case, I've got 34. And for the purpose of this conversation, let's just drill in one more time. Let's drill into those 34 vulnerabilities. Again, look at the breadcrumb at the top of the screen. You can see where we are. So now I can see all the way from where I started, which is my process, all the way down to my IT asset. I can now see the open vulnerabilities that are associated with that IT asset. And again, I can manipulate this list ready for remediation. But where this gets really interesting is if I go back up to my process and scroll down again to where I'm looking at my vulnerabilities against a business process, I can very clearly see that I now have 58 open vulnerabilities that perhaps are of concern, which may jeopardize this process. And if it's a key process, things like pipeline generation or demand gen activities or processes, key for businesses' growth expectations, then this is a very unusual view of the world to be able to understand that my process or outcome is materially at risk because we've demonstrated that it's vulnerable. And so those vulnerabilities need to be prioritized for remediation where appropriate. This is where we need to get to, and this is the nirvana. If you'd like to learn more, then we'd be delighted to speak with you. But with that, I'm going to call it a close and thank you for your attention.